Funny how the people who call you lazy are often the ones who have never stayed awake through your darkest nights. The laughter came first. Not loud enough to be rude, just loud enough to hurt. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala, turning the polished marble floor into a sea of reflections. The room was filled with New York's elite. CEOs, investors, politicians, people whose names appeared on magazine covers and financial networks every week. At the center of it all stood Ethan Whitmore. At 43 years old, Ethan had become one of the most successful real estate developers in America. His company owned luxury properties across multiple states. Business magazines praised his vision. Television hosts admired his confidence. Investors trusted his instincts. Tonight, he looked exactly like the powerful billionaire everyone expected him to be. Confident, polished, untouchable. Standing beside him was his wife, Naomi Whitmore. Naomi wore a simple emerald evening gown that flowed elegantly to the floor. Her deep brown skin glowed beneath the warm chandelier light. She carried herself with quiet grace, offering polite smiles whenever guests approached. Most people barely noticed her. That had become normal. For years, Ethan had been the star everyone wanted to see. Naomi was simply the woman standing beside him. A group of investors gathered around Ethan near the center of the ballroom. Champagne glasses clinked softly as conversations drifted through the air. One of the men laughed. "Ethan, I swear I don't know how you find time for everything." The others nodded. "Running a company that size would kill most people. Meanwhile, I barely survive a normal workweek." More laughter followed. Ethan grinned. "I don't have much choice." "You're lucky," another guest said. "At least you've got someone at home making life easier." Several eyes shifted toward Naomi. She offered a polite smile. The guest continued. "My wife reminds me every day how hard she works." A few people chuckled. Then Ethan said something that changed the atmosphere around the table. "Trust me," he replied casually. "Naomi isn't exactly overworking herself." More laughter. Naomi felt her fingers tighten slightly around her champagne glass. Nobody seemed to notice. Ethan took a sip of his drink. "Half the time she's sleeping while normal people are working." The group laughed harder. Someone shook his head. "Sounds like she's figured life out. Maybe I should take lessons." The conversation continued. The jokes continued. Naomi remained silent. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inside, something hurt. Not because strangers were laughing. Because Ethan was. The man who should have known better. The man who knew she left the house almost every evening. The man who knew she rarely returned before sunrise. The man who had never once asked why. Across the ballroom, a string quartet began playing a softer melody. Guests moved between tables draped in ivory linen. Waiters carried silver trays through the crowd. Everything looked beautiful. Everything felt distant. Ethan continued speaking with investors as if nothing had happened. As if his words carried no weight. As if humiliation became harmless when wrapped inside a joke. Naomi looked around the ballroom. She noticed the expensive dresses. The designer tuxedos. The effortless confidence that money seemed to create. Most of these people believed they understood success. Most believed they understood hard work. Very few understood sacrifice. A woman nearby leaned closer. "Do you ever get bored?" she asked Naomi. Naomi blinked. "Bored?" The woman smiled. "With Ethan working all the time." For a moment, Naomi considered answering honestly. She considered explaining where she spent her nights. She considered explaining why her alarm clock rang when most people were preparing for bed. She considered telling them things they had never bothered to learn. Instead, she simply smiled. "Not really." The woman nodded politely before returning to her conversation. Nobody asked another question. Nobody seemed interested in the answer. Near the stage, Ethan glanced toward Naomi. For a brief second, their eyes met. 5 years earlier, he would have crossed an entire room to make sure she was happy. Tonight, he simply looked away. The orchestra continued playing. Champagne continued flowing. The gala continued shining beneath thousands of lights. Yet somewhere deep inside Naomi, a quiet realization began to form. The people in this ballroom thought they knew who she was. The problem was not that they underestimated her. The problem was that Ethan did too. And before this story was over, an entire city was about to discover just how wrong they all were. Most people assume secrets are hidden because someone is ashamed of them. The truth is often much simpler. Some secrets survive because nobody cares enough to ask. The gala ended shortly after midnight. Luxury cars lined the street outside the Whitmore Foundation ballroom, while Manhattan's skyline glittered against the summer sky. Guests exchanged handshakes and final smiles before disappearing into waiting chauffeurs and private elevators. Ethan Whitmore stood near the entrance speaking with investors. Another deal. Another opportunity. Another conversation about money. By the time he finally climbed into the back of his black sedan, Naomi was already beside him. Neither spoke. The silence between them felt familiar now. Not hostile. Not comfortable. Just routine. The driver pulled away from the curb. Streetlights drifted across the windows as Manhattan moved around them. Ethan checked emails on his phone. Naomi stared outside. 20 minutes later, they arrived at their penthouse overlooking Central Park. The city stretched endlessly beneath them. Millions of lights. Millions of lives. Millions of stories. Most of which Ethan never thought about. The moment they stepped inside, he loosened his tie and headed toward his office. Naomi quietly removed her earrings. The clock on the wall read 5:47 p.m. Her shift would begin soon. Ethan glanced up. Going out again? The question sounded less like curiosity and more like habit. Naomi nodded. Yes. Tonight too. Like every night. Ethan shook his head. You know, most people your age actually sleep at normal hours. Naomi looked at him. For a brief moment, she considered explaining everything. Then she remembered how many opportunities he had already ignored. Instead, she simply smiled. I'll be back in the morning. Ethan returned his attention to the laptop. Conversation over. The elevator doors closed behind her a few minutes later. Outside, warm evening air wrapped around the city. Naomi crossed the sidewalk and entered a waiting rideshare. The driver asked where she was headed. She gave the address. The vehicle pulled into traffic. Downtown lights blurred past the windows. Restaurants filled with families. Tourists crowded sidewalks. Office workers headed home. Meanwhile, Naomi was beginning her day. An hour later, she stepped out near a large building illuminated by bright white lights. People moved quickly through the entrance. Some carried medical bags. Others wore identification badges clipped to their uniforms. Nobody greeted Naomi like a celebrity. Nobody cared who her husband was. Here, only competence mattered. She passed through security, swiped her badge, entered a restricted operations floor. Rows of monitors stretched across a massive room. Phones rang continuously. Digital maps covered entire walls. Information flowed across dozens of screens. Every second mattered. Every decision mattered. Several employees immediately approached her. Good evening, Naomi. We've got updated reports from Brooklyn. The overnight forecast just changed. 2 facilities are requesting additional support. Naomi listened carefully. Questions, answers, numbers, assessments, priorities. Within minutes, she was moving through reports with calm precision. Her expression never changed. Her voice remained steady. The room responded instantly. One supervisor watched her for a moment, then smiled. Things always run smoother when you're here. Naomi laughed softly. Let's hope tonight stays quiet. The supervisor raised an eyebrow. We both know it never does. Around the room, dozens of professionals continued working. Most of them had no idea Naomi was married to one of the richest men in New York. Most would not have cared. Out beyond the walls of the building, ambulances moved through city streets. Hospitals prepared for another long night. Emergency teams checked equipment. Doctors reviewed incoming cases. And above them all, hidden from public view, an enormous system worked. Silently, to keep everything connected. Naomi sat at her station. The glow of dozens of monitors reflected in her eyes. Outside, the city prepared for sleep. Inside, her night was only beginning. Back at the penthouse, Ethan finished another conference call and glanced toward the empty side of the bed. For a second, he frowned. Not because he missed her, because he realized he honestly had no idea what his wife did every night. The thought lingered briefly. Then he dismissed it. Surely it couldn't be that important. Across the city, Naomi received another incoming report and immediately turned toward the screen. The next 8 hours would prove just how wrong that assumption truly was. The most dangerous words are not always spoken in anger. Sometimes they are spoken casually, carelessly, as if they mean nothing. And that is exactly how Ethan Whitmore said them. The next evening began like every other. The penthouse overlooked Central Park. The city glowed beneath the setting sun. Ethan sat at the dining table reviewing documents while Naomi prepared to leave for another shift. She wore simple clothes. No designer labels. No expensive jewelry. Nothing that suggested the importance of what she actually did. To Ethan, it looked like she was going nowhere special. He watched her collect her bag. Again. Every night. Year after year. The routine had become almost invisible to him. Finally, he looked up. You know something? Naomi paused near the door. Ethan leaned back in his chair. The city would never notice if you stopped working tomorrow. The words hung in the air. Cold. Dismissive. Effortless. As if he had merely commented on the weather. Naomi stared at him. Not shocked. Not angry. Just tired. Very tired. Because she had heard versions of those words for years. Different phrasing. Same message. What she did was unimportant. What she contributed did not matter. What she sacrificed went unseen. Ethan continued. I mean seriously. He gestured toward the window. Millions of people out there. He laughed softly. If you disappeared from that job tonight, nothing would change. The statement sounded logical to him. He believed it. After all, nobody talked about Naomi's work. Nobody celebrated it. Nobody wrote magazine articles about it. Nobody invited her onto business panels. Nobody called her a visionary. Those titles belonged to people like Ethan. People whose names appeared on buildings. People whose faces appeared on television. People whose success could be measured in dollars. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Then she looked back at her husband. The man she had supported for nearly 2 decades. The man she had encouraged when his business was failing. The man who once promised he would never forget where he came from. Sometimes she wondered when exactly that promise disappeared. Maybe it happened gradually. One successful deal at a time. One magazine cover at a time. $1 billion at a time. Until eventually the man she loved became someone who only recognized value when it generated profit. You really think that? She asked quietly. Ethan shrugged. I'm just being honest. Honest. The word almost made her smile. Because honesty without understanding was often just arrogance wearing a better suit. For several seconds neither spoke. Outside, sirens echoed faintly through Manhattan traffic. The city continued moving, unaware of the conversation taking place hundreds of feet above the streets. Finally, Naomi nodded. Good night, Ethan. She opened the door. That's it, he asked. She stopped. What else should I say? Ethan frowned. I don't know. Neither did she. Because there was no argument worth having. No explanation he would believe. No defense she wanted to make anymore. The elevator doors closed. And Naomi left. Once again, across the city, she arrived at the operations center shortly before her shift began. The atmosphere felt different tonight. Busier. Tighter. Several employees moved quickly between workstations. Large screens displayed weather updates. Transportation alerts. Emergency resource reports. The overnight forecast had changed. A severe weather system was approaching faster than expected. Not catastrophic, but serious enough to concern experienced professionals. Naomi immediately joined a briefing. A manager pointed toward one of the screens. We may have flooding in multiple districts. Another supervisor added. Hospitals are already preparing contingency plans. Naomi listened carefully. Questions. Data. Projections. Risk assessments. The room operated like a living organism. Every person connected. Every department dependent on another. Every decision affecting thousands of people. By midnight, conditions had become more complicated. Calls increased. Reports multiplied. Weather models shifted again. Naomi moved from station to station. Reviewing updates. Coordinating teams. Adjusting resources. Remaining calm while others grew tense. One younger employee watched her work. How do you stay so calm? Naomi smiled. You focus on the next problem. The employee nodded. What if there are too many problems? Naomi looked at the wall of monitors. There always are. Then she returned to work. Hours passed. Outside, dark clouds gathered beyond the city skyline. Inside, dozens of professionals prepared for a long night. Back at the penthouse, Ethan finished another interview with a business magazine. The reporter praised his leadership, his vision, his impact. After the call ended, he poured himself a drink and stared across the empty apartment. For some reason, Naomi's question replayed in his mind. You really think that? Of course he did. At least that was what he told himself. Yet somewhere deep inside, an unfamiliar feeling appeared. Not guilt. Not regret. Something else. A tiny doubt. A question he had never bothered asking. What exactly did Naomi do every night? Across the city, Naomi sat before a wall of glowing screens as new alerts began appearing one after another. And for the first time in years, events were moving toward a night that would force everyone, including Ethan Whitmore, to finally discover the answer. Disasters rarely announce themselves. Most begin with a small warning that people believe they can ignore. Then another, and another, until suddenly the problem becomes impossible to avoid. At 1:17 a.m., the first major alert appeared. A red notification flashed across one of the operations center screens. Several employees immediately turned toward it. A transportation hub in Lower Manhattan had reported severe flooding. Minutes later, another alert arrived. Then another. Weather conditions were deteriorating faster than expected. Rain hammered the city. Wind rattled windows. Visibility dropped across multiple districts. Naomi studied the incoming reports. Her expression remained calm, but the room around her was changing. The relaxed conversations had disappeared. Every workstation was active. Every screen displayed new information. Phones rang continuously. A supervisor approached Naomi. "We've got 3 facilities requesting emergency support." Naomi nodded. "Prioritize the hospitals first. What about the transportation network? Keep resources moving where they're needed most." The supervisor immediately relayed the instructions. Around the room, teams responded. No hesitation. No confusion. Just action. The clock continued ticking. 2:04 a.m., 2:31 a.m., 2:47 a.m. The situation kept escalating. Across Manhattan, emergency crews worked through heavy rain. Traffic slowed. Flooded streets created delays. Power fluctuations affected several neighborhoods. People sleeping in luxury apartments barely noticed. But behind the scenes, hundreds of professionals were fighting to prevent small problems from becoming major ones, including Naomi. She moved between workstations reviewing updates, checking projections, approving requests, adjusting priorities, making dozens of decisions every hour. Most invisible, yet all important. At 3:12 a.m., a new report appeared. The room immediately went quiet. One of the senior analysts stood. "We have a problem." Everyone looked up. A critical support system serving multiple facilities had begun experiencing failures. Not a total collapse. Not yet. But if conditions worsened, the consequences could spread rapidly. The analyst continued. "We're already seeing delays." Another employee added. "And demand is increasing." Naomi stepped closer to the screen. Rows of numbers filled the display. Status indicators, performance reports, emergency requests. Information flowed faster than anyone could process manually. Several people began speaking at once. Suggestions, concerns, worst-case scenarios. The tension grew. Naomi raised one hand. The room fell silent. Not because she was the loudest, because people trusted her. She examined the data. Again and again, searching for patterns, searching for solutions, searching for the one decision that mattered most. Outside, the storm intensified. Rain pounded rooftops. Water collected in streets. Emergency vehicles moved through difficult conditions. Across the city, people relied on systems they never thought about. Systems they assumed would always work. Systems connected to the room where Naomi now stood. Back at the penthouse, Ethan slept peacefully. The storm barely registered. The city below looked distant from 40 stories above the ground. Safe, controlled, predictable. He had no idea that only a few miles away, teams were working through one of the most demanding nights of the year. He certainly had no idea his wife stood at the center of it. At 3:48 a.m., another warning arrived. The room grew even quieter. The situation was becoming serious. Very serious. One younger employee looked nervous. "What happens if we can't stabilize it?" Nobody answered immediately, because everyone understood the question. The consequences would affect far more than a single building, far more than a single neighborhood. Naomi looked toward the massive wall of screens. Data continued flowing. Alerts continued arriving. Time continued slipping away. Then she spoke. "We're not going to wait for conditions to improve." Several heads turned. Naomi pointed toward a series of reports. "Move those resources now." A supervisor blinked. Immediately. What if the projections are wrong? Naomi didn't hesitate. What if they're right? The room became silent once more. Because everyone understood. Waiting carried its own risk. Sometimes the most dangerous decision was doing nothing. The supervisor nodded. Orders were transmitted. Teams began moving. Resources were reassigned. Plans changed. And the entire operation shifted direction. No celebration followed. No applause. No dramatic speeches. Just professionals doing their jobs. But something important had happened. A choice had been made. One that would influence everything that followed. Outside, storm clouds continued covering the city. Emergency calls continued increasing. Pressure continued building. And deep inside the operations center, Naomi returned to her workstation as new alerts appeared across the screens. The worst of the night had not arrived yet. In fact, the real crisis was only beginning. And before sunrise, the entire city would learn just how fragile normal life could become when one critical system stood on the edge of failure. By 4 a.m., the storm was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. Rain continued falling across New York. Emergency requests continued arriving. And inside the operations center, every screen seemed to flash with new warnings. The decision Naomi had made minutes earlier was already being tested. No one knew yet whether it would work. But there was no turning back. Resources were moving. Teams were responding. Critical systems were adjusting. The city was entering the most dangerous hours of the night. A supervisor hurried across the room. First update. Everyone looked up. The numbers appeared on the main display. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then someone exhaled. The situation had stopped getting worse. Not solved. Not fixed. But stabilized. For now, Naomi remained focused. Keep monitoring. The supervisor nodded. Understood. The younger employees looked relieved. The senior analysts looked cautious. Because they understood something important. The storm wasn't over. And neither was the crisis. At 4:18 a.m., another series of reports arrived. Several facilities that had been struggling were now operating more efficiently. Emergency response times improved. Pressure on the system decreased. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. Enough to buy time. And sometimes time was the most valuable resource of all. Around the room, people continued working. Coffee cups accumulated on desks. Eyes remained fixed on monitors. Voices stayed calm despite the growing fatigue. In the center of it all stood Naomi. She wasn't the loudest person in the room. She wasn't the highest-ranking executive. She wasn't interested in attention. But every major decision eventually reached her desk. Every critical update eventually reached her screen. And every person in the room trusted her judgment. One analyst leaned toward a colleague. If she hadn't moved those resources, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. The room continued humming with activity. Phones, computers, radios, constant communication, constant coordination, constant pressure. At 4:47 a.m., a major alert suddenly appeared. The room froze. Several screens flashed red simultaneously. An employee immediately stood. We've got a surge. Another voice followed. It's spreading faster than expected. The atmosphere changed instantly. Whatever progress they had made now felt fragile. One mistake could erase it. One delay could undo hours of work. Several teams began talking at once. Possible responses. Emergency procedures. Contingency plans. The noise grew louder. Then Naomi spoke. Quiet. The room obeyed. Not because of authority. Because of confidence. She studied the incoming information. The numbers. The projections. The trends. The hidden details buried inside thousands of lines of data. Most people saw chaos. Naomi saw a pattern. And patterns told stories. After several seconds, she pointed toward one section of the display. There. A supervisor narrowed his eyes. You think that's the source? I'm sure. The room immediately shifted focus. Analysts began checking the information, comparing reports, verifying data. Then one by one, they reached the same conclusion. Naomi was right. Again, the actual problem wasn't where everyone expected. The real issue was hidden inside a secondary system that had quietly become overloaded. A dangerous problem, but one that could still be managed. If they moved quickly, orders were issued. Teams responded. Adjustments were made. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Everyone watched. Waiting. Hoping. At 5:11 a.m., the first positive indicators appeared. Several employees smiled. Others simply nodded. The system was responding. The pressure was decreasing. The crisis was beginning to retreat. Not because of luck. Not because the storm weakened. Because someone had identified the problem before it became catastrophic. Because someone understood how everything connected. Because someone had seen what others missed. Naomi returned to her workstation. No celebration. No recognition. No applause. Just another task waiting for her attention. Outside, the rain slowly began losing strength. The sky remained dark. But dawn was approaching. Across the city, millions of people slept peacefully. Hospitals continued operating. Emergency services continued responding. Critical facilities continued functioning. Most residents would never know how close the situation had come to becoming something far worse. Most would never know who helped prevent it. Back in the penthouse, Ethan finally woke. He stretched and glanced toward the empty side of the bed. Naomi still wasn't home. For a moment, irritation crossed his face. Another night shift. Another night he barely thought about. He picked up his phone and checked the morning headlines. Several stories were beginning to appear. Reports about overnight disruptions. Reports about emergency responses. Reports praising the teams that had worked through the storm. Ethan barely paid attention. He had meetings to attend, investors to call, deals to close. He placed the phone down and walked toward the kitchen, completely unaware that his wife's name was already moving through conversations across multiple departments throughout the city. Completely unaware that people were discussing decisions she had made only hours earlier. And completely unaware that before the day ended, he would finally discover what Naomi had really been doing every night while he called her lazy. By sunrise, the worst of the storm had passed. The rain weakened. The winds calmed. And slowly, New York began waking up. Millions of people stepped into another ordinary morning. Or at least what they believed was an ordinary morning. Subway riders checked their phones. Office workers bought coffee. Parents prepared children for school. Delivery trucks rolled through busy streets. Hospitals continued operating. Emergency services continued responding. Life moved forward. Most people never realized how close the city had come to serious disruption. Most never knew how many decisions had been made while they slept. Most never knew who made them. Inside the operations center, however, everyone knew. The night shift was ending. Employees looked exhausted. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others stared silently at screens that finally showed stability instead of warnings. The atmosphere felt different now. Not relaxed. Not yet. But relieved. A supervisor walked toward Naomi. He held a report in his hand. For a moment, he simply looked at her. Then he smiled. "We did it." Naomi glanced at the numbers. The critical systems had stabilized. Emergency response times had improved. The facilities under pressure were functioning normally again. The crisis had been contained. Not perfectly. No emergency ever was. But the city had avoided something much worse. The supervisor shook his head. "You saved us hours ago." Naomi smiled politely. "It was a team effort." The supervisor laughed. "That's exactly why everyone respects you." Around the room, several employees nodded. One younger analyst spoke up. "I've never seen anyone stay that calm." Another added, "I thought we were finished at one point." A few people laughed quietly. Not because the night had been funny. Because it was finally over. For the first time in hours, the pressure began lifting from their shoulders. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, television stations started broadcasting morning reports. News anchors discussed the overnight storm. Images appeared on screens. Flooded intersections. Emergency crews. Weather maps. Transportation updates. And one particular story. The successful coordination efforts that helped maintain critical city operations throughout the night. The details remained limited. Most viewers paid little attention. But not everyone. At a luxury office tower in Midtown, Ethan Whitmore sat inside a conference room preparing for an investor presentation. Several executives gathered around a polished table. Coffee cups sat beside laptops. Financial reports covered the screens. Business as usual. Or so Ethan thought. The meeting began. Numbers. Forecasts. Growth projections. The language Ethan understood best. Then the conference room television, muted in the background, caught someone's attention. A weather segment was ending. A reporter was discussing the previous night's emergency response. One executive glanced toward the screen. "That storm looked worse than I realized." Another nodded. "I heard several major systems nearly failed." Ethan barely listened. His focus remained on business. Until another executive spoke. Apparently one operations director made a huge difference. Ethan continued reviewing documents. The conversation seemed irrelevant. Then he heard a name. Naomi. His eyes lifted immediately. The room continued talking. Someone mentioned a city operations team. Someone mentioned overnight coordination. Someone mentioned leadership under pressure. Ethan frowned. Surely they couldn't be talking about his wife. His wife worked night shifts. His wife disappeared every evening. His wife, according to him, spent years doing work that hardly seemed important. At least that was what he had always believed. The discussion moved on. But Ethan couldn't. The name echoed in his mind. Naomi. A few minutes later his phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. And again. Messages. Emails. Notifications. Several came from people he knew. Several referenced the same thing. Outstanding leadership. Critical decisions. Overnight emergency response. And one familiar name. Naomi Whitmore. Ethan stared at the screen. Confused. Disbelieving. For the first time, he began opening the messages. Reading carefully. Actually paying attention. The more he read, the quieter he became. Meanwhile, Naomi exited the operations center and stepped outside. The storm clouds were gone. Morning sunlight reflected from glass skyscrapers. The city was alive again. People hurried past without recognizing her, without knowing her name, without understanding what had happened during the night. And Naomi preferred it that way. She wasn't interested in attention. She wasn't interested in praise. She had simply done her job. The same job she had done countless nights before. The same job Ethan had dismissed countless times before. Naomi took a deep breath and started walking home. Behind her, the city continued moving. Ahead of her, a new day was beginning. And miles away, inside a luxury conference room, Ethan Whitmore was finally starting to realize that the woman he called lazy might be one of the most important people he had ever failed to understand. By noon, the story was everywhere. Not because a celebrity had done something outrageous. Not because a politician had made headlines. Because an entire city wanted to know who had helped keep critical services running during one of the worst overnight emergencies of the year. The story spread quietly at first. A local news segment. A brief online article. A social media post from a city official. Then another. And another. Within hours, thousands of people were sharing the same name. Naomi Whitmore. Most had never heard of her before. Now everyone wanted to know more. Inside the operations center, Naomi sat in a small break room finishing a cup of coffee. She had been awake for nearly 24 hours. The adrenaline was gone. The exhaustion had arrived. Her phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. And again. She frowned. Messages filled the screen. Co-workers. Former colleagues. Friends she had not spoken to in years. Congratulations. Amazing work. You deserve this. Proud of you. Naomi blinked. Confused. One co-worker hurried into the room, carrying a tablet. You need to see this. Naomi looked up. The screen showed a live television broadcast. A reporter stood outside city headquarters. Behind her, large digital graphics displayed images from the storm. Emergency response timelines. Operations center footage. System recovery statistics. And then Naomi's photograph appeared. The room became silent. Even Naomi stared. The reporter spoke directly into the camera. Officials are crediting Operations Director Naomi Whitmore and her overnight team for helping coordinate the response that prevented widespread disruption across multiple critical services. Naomi lowered her eyes. The attention felt strange. Uncomfortable. She had never wanted recognition. She had never expected recognition. For years she had worked behind the scenes. Invisible. Anonymous. Necessary. The reporter continued. Several officials described Whitmore's leadership during the emergency as decisive and instrumental. Around the break room, employees smiled. Some applauded. Others nodded proudly. Not because Naomi had demanded respect, because she had earned it. Over and over again. For years. Meanwhile, across New York, the story continued growing. Articles multiplied. Interviews appeared. Experts discussed the emergency response. One former commissioner appeared on a television panel. The public often forgets that cities rely on people making impossible decisions at impossible hours, he said. Last night was one of those moments. Another expert agreed. Without strong leadership, the outcome could have been very different. Again, Naomi's name appeared. Again and again. At Ethan Whitmore's office, nobody was discussing quarterly earnings anymore. Nobody was discussing investment strategies. Everyone was discussing Naomi. Executives passed around articles. Assistants shared clips. Phones displayed headlines. Ethan sat motionless. Listening. Reading. Watching. Every new report felt heavier than the last, because every report described the same woman. The woman he had mocked. The woman he had dismissed. The woman he had called lazy. The woman who spent years leaving home at night while he barely cared where she went. Now reporters were calling her a leader. Experts were praising her judgment. Officials were thanking her publicly. The contrast made Ethan uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. One executive finally looked at him. "Your wife is extraordinary." The words hit harder than Ethan expected, because they were spoken so casually, as if everyone else already knew. Everyone except him. For the first time, Ethan remembered every cruel joke, every dismissive comment, every time Naomi had tried explaining her work while he barely listened. The memories returned one after another, and each one felt worse. Meanwhile, Naomi finally left the operations center. The city looked different now, not because the buildings had changed, not because the streets had changed, because people were beginning to recognize her. A woman crossing the sidewalk paused. "Excuse me." Naomi stopped. The woman smiled. "Were you on the news?" Naomi hesitated. "Maybe." The woman laughed softly. "My husband showed me the story this morning." For a moment neither spoke. Then the woman simply said, "Thank you." Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No grand gesture. Just two words. "Thank you." Naomi smiled. A genuine smile. Perhaps the first one she had allowed herself all day. The woman walked away. The city continued moving. Cars passed. People hurried to meetings. Life continued. Yet something had changed. For years, Naomi's work existed in darkness. For years, her contributions remained invisible. For years, people only noticed the billionaire husband. Now the spotlight was shifting. Now people were noticing the woman behind the headlines. And somewhere across the city, Ethan Whitmore sat alone in his office, staring at another television screen. Another report. Another interview. Another mention of Naomi. The realization was becoming impossible to ignore. The world was finally seeing who Naomi Whitmore truly was. And Ethan was beginning to understand that he might be the last person who ever did. 3 days later, the invitation arrived. Not for Ethan. For Naomi. A city recognition ceremony. A formal event honoring emergency personnel, operations leaders, and public servants who had helped protect New York during the storm. Naomi read the email twice. Then a third time. She almost declined. Recognition had never interested her. Attention had never interested her. Doing the work had always been enough. But her supervisor convinced her otherwise. "You spent years helping everyone else," he said. "Let people say thank you." So Naomi agreed. The ceremony was held inside one of Manhattan's most prestigious ballrooms. The same kind of place Ethan attended regularly. Crystal chandeliers. Elegant tables. Political leaders. Business executives. Media representatives. Community leaders. The city's most influential people filled the room. And this time, Naomi was not standing unnoticed in the corner. This time, she was one of the guests of honor. Meanwhile, Ethan arrived carrying emotions he could barely understand. Regret, confusion, shame. For days he had watched interviews, read articles, listened to experts. Every piece of information revealed something new, and every revelation forced him to confront the same truth. He never really knew his wife. The realization followed him everywhere. Into meetings, into elevators, into empty rooms, into silence, especially into silence. As the ceremony began, Ethan spotted Naomi across the ballroom. She wore a simple, elegant dress. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to attract attention. Yet people kept approaching her, shaking her hand, thanking her, smiling, wanting to meet her. The sight felt strange. Not because Naomi looked different. Because everyone else seemed to understand her value long before he did. The program started. Awards were presented. Speeches were given. Names were called. Applause filled the room again and again. Then the host stepped onto the stage. The atmosphere shifted. The room became quieter, more focused. The host smiled. "Our next recognition goes to someone who represents leadership at its very best." A large screen illuminated behind him. Images from the storm appeared. Emergency maps. Operations center footage. Recovery reports. Then Naomi's photograph filled the screen. The ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Not routine applause. Real applause. The kind that comes from genuine respect. Naomi looked surprised. Almost embarrassed. The host continued. While millions of New Yorkers slept, critical decisions were being made. Decisions that helped maintain essential services during one of the most challenging nights our city faced this year. The applause grew louder. Again and again, one leader demonstrated extraordinary judgment, calm, and dedication. People began standing. One row, then another, then another. Soon, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. A standing ovation. For Naomi, the room thundered with applause. And Ethan sat frozen, unable to move, unable to look away, because he remembered another ballroom, another public event, another crowd. Only that night had been different. That night people had laughed while Naomi stood quietly beside him. That night he had allowed her dignity to be diminished. That night he had believed she was less important than he was. Now the entire room stood for her. Not because she was married to a billionaire. Not because of wealth. Not because of status. Because of who she was. Because of what she had done. Because of the character she carried when nobody was watching. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. The applause continued. And for the first time, he understood what real respect looked like. Naomi slowly walked toward the stage. The standing ovation continued. Some people wiped away tears. Others smiled proudly. Several city officials waited to greet her. The mayor shook her hand. A commissioner thanked her personally. A television camera followed every step. Yet Naomi remained exactly the same. Calm, graceful, humble. The host handed her the microphone. The room finally quieted. Hundreds of people waited. Naomi looked across the audience, across the tables, across the faces, and eventually her eyes found Ethan. For only a second. Then she looked away. The moment hit harder than any speech could have, because there was no anger in her expression, no bitterness, no accusation, only distance. The kind of distance created after years of being unseen. Naomi turned back toward the audience. She smiled softly. I was never alone that night, she said. An entire team stood beside me. The room applauded again. Of course, she shared the credit. That was who she was. Always had been. Ethan lowered his eyes. Because while the ballroom celebrated Naomi Whitmore, another realization was settling inside him. The city had discovered her worth in a matter of days. The people in this room recognized it immediately. Her colleagues had recognized it for years. And somehow, after all their years together, he had been the one person who failed to see it. The applause returned once more, louder than before. And as Ethan listened to hundreds of people honoring the woman he loved, he began wondering whether his understanding had arrived too late. The ceremony ended, but the applause stayed with Ethan. It followed him out of the ballroom, into the car, into the silence of the ride home, into every thought he could not escape. For years, he had measured success in numbers, revenue, investments, acquisitions, market value, the language of billionaires, the language he understood. Yet none of it explained what he had witnessed that night. No amount of money could buy the respect Naomi had earned. No title could manufacture the admiration that filled that ballroom. No fortune could force hundreds of people to stand and applaud. That kind of recognition came from something else. Character, service, sacrifice, things Naomi possessed in abundance, and things Ethan had spent years overlooking. The next morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual. The house felt different. Quieter, larger, lonelier. Naomi was already awake, sitting near the window with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise, the same way she had done hundreds of mornings before. For a moment, Ethan simply watched her. No cameras, no audience, no applause, just Naomi, the woman who had stood beside him through every failure, every risk, every setback, every impossible dream. The woman he had once promised never to take for granted, and somehow did exactly that. He walked toward her, carefully, as if approaching something fragile. Naomi. She looked up, calmly. Good morning. The words were polite, respectful, but distant. The distance hurt more than anger ever could. Ethan sat across from her. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. I'm sorry. The words sounded small, almost insignificant. After everything, Naomi studied him quietly, then looked back toward the window. The sunrise painted gold across the city skyline. You've said that before. Ethan lowered his eyes. Because she was right. He had apologized before. For missed anniversaries. For forgotten promises. For putting work first. But those apologies had never addressed the deeper problem. The way he had slowly stopped seeing her. The way he assumed she would always stay. The way he treated her presence as something guaranteed. I know, he said softly. But I understand now. Naomi smiled sadly. No, Ethan. The answer was gentle. Not cruel. Not angry. Just honest. You understand now because everyone else finally showed you. The truth landed heavily. Because it was true. He had needed newspapers, television interviews, public recognition, a standing ovation, an entire city, to recognize what had been sitting beside him. All along, tears threatened to form in Ethan's eyes. I was wrong. Naomi nodded. Yes. Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No accusation. Just truth. And somehow that made it harder. For the first time in years, Ethan had no defense. No argument. No explanation. Only regret. Weeks passed. Life continued. The city moved forward. The storm became history. The headlines gradually disappeared. But something inside Ethan remained changed. He began listening more. Speaking less. Watching more carefully. Learning things he should have known years ago. The books Naomi loved. The causes she supported. The colleagues who respected her. The quiet ways she helped people without expecting recognition. He discovered an extraordinary woman. The same woman who had always been there. One evening, several months later, they attended another public event. A charity fundraiser. Elegant. Formal. Familiar. The kind of gathering where status usually dominated every conversation. As they entered the ballroom, something happened. People approached Naomi first. Not Ethan. Naomi. Community leaders greeted her warmly. Guests thanked her. Several people asked for photographs. Others wanted to hear her opinions. Ethan watched from beside her. And this time he smiled. Because he finally understood. Recognition was never the point. Naomi would have been the same woman if nobody had applauded. The same woman if no cameras existed. The same woman if no articles had ever been written. Her worth had never depended on public validation. Only his blindness had. Later that evening, Naomi stepped onto a balcony overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly below. Ethan joined her. Neither spoke immediately. The cool night air settled around them. Then Naomi smiled. A real smile. Small, but genuine. And for the first time in a very long time, the distance between them felt slightly smaller. Not erased. Not repaired overnight. Just smaller. A beginning. Ethan looked across the city. The city Naomi had helped protect. The city that had recognized her before he did. And he realized the greatest lesson of his life had nothing to do with business. Nothing to do with wealth. Nothing to do with success. The most valuable person in his world had never been standing in front of him. She had been standing beside him all along. And while a billionaire's fortune could build skyscrapers, buy companies, and shape industries, it could never replace the quiet strength, dignity, and love of a woman like Naomi Whitmore. Because in the end, the city remembered the night Naomi saved hundreds. But Ethan remembered something even more important. The day he finally learned to see her.